Hey guys, welcome back to another impressions video, and as you can tell, I am very excited. I'm wearing my t-shirt, I have A Link to the Past playing in the background, and I'm here to talk about this game right here, The Legend of Zelda, A Link Between Worlds for the Nintendo 3DS. And the curse has been finally broken. This is my first handheld Zelda game that I was able to beat, which may sound strange because I'm a huge Zelda fan. In fact, the Legend of the Zelda series is my favorite series in gaming. So it was a little bit odd. I did play Link's Awakening. I did play Phantom Hourglass. I played the Minish Cap, but for one reason or another, I always got sidetracked and I was never able to beat those games. So I'm pretty happy to have this as my first handheld Zelda game that I beat. And I do have to say, this game is very, very good. However, I think it did not quite meet my expectations, which I have to say they were very, very high. I was pretty happy to find out that most of the major gaming publications had near perfect or perfect reviews for this game. A lot of 10s out of 10s, a lot of Game of the Year awards, and to top that, a lot of the fellow YouTubers here in the community picked this game as their favorite of 2013. So my hype and my expectations were obviously very, very high. Not to mention the fact that I'm a huge A Link to the Past fan. It's one of my favorite games of all time. Granted, not my favorite Zelda game. Ocarina of Time still remains my favorite Zelda game, but I'm a huge A Link to the Past fan. So this is the sequel, so I was naturally excited to try this game and play it. And again, I do have to say, very good game, but there were a couple of things that irked me, and that I'm going to talk about. But let's just jump right into the story of the game. I'm going to be very brief. Most of you have probably already played the game and have beaten it. So no spoilers or anything. I'm just going to briefly say that this game happens a few years after A Link to the Past, and this evil creature called Yuga, it's kidnapping people, putting them into paintings, and it's up to you to save those peoples that the people that he's imprisoning, and find out what his motives are. So that's all I'm gonna say really about the story and the ending. Again, I'm not gonna spoil anything, but I just want to say that the ending of this game, it's probably one of my favorites, if not my favorite Zelda ending out there. So very, very much worth playing this game to completion. And I think this game, it's taking the storytelling in previous Zelda games was perhaps a little bit oversimplistic, but this game did a very good job of engaging myself into the story. Although I do have to say that there's not a huge development story-wise throughout the game. It's basically you get introduced to a storyline, and then everything happens pretty much at the end of the game. So in between, there's not really any major developments, if you will, like other games. Like RPGs, there's usually a progression, a natural progression in the story, if you will. And whereas in this game, you get an introduction, and then you play the game, and at the end everything unveils and unravels at the end. So very enjoyable story, very enjoyable ending. As far as the graphics, I know a lot of people criticize the game, and I do have to say that I was a little bit worried about the graphics, because nothing about the graphics in this game is very impressive, and I still hold to that opinion. But again, the game looks good enough. They opted to have 3D models and characters instead of the 2D sprites that we all know and love from A Link to the Past. But I don't have anything against the art direction. I know a lot of people were very critical of the art direction that Nintendo chose to go with this game, but the game looks good enough, and the good news is that the game runs very well. The performance in this game is very good. It runs at 60 frames per second even after you activate the 3D effects on the Nintendo 3DS. So very impressive performance, pretty good graphics for what it is. And basically about the gameplay, this is where I have a few of my gripes, if you will. The game follows the footsteps of A Link to the Past in the sense that you're able to travel between two worlds a light and dark world, very similar to A Link to the Past. In this case, it's not the same setting. Well, Hyrule is the same setting, but this time you go to a different parallel world called Lorule, which is the equivalent of the Dark World, and it's very seamless. Going back and forth through the different worlds, it's very seamless, very easy to do, and pretty fun as well. And I just don't want to spoil anything too much, but they did a pretty good job. The overworld in this game is essentially the same as the one from A Link to the Past. So if you're familiar with that game, you're gonna feel right at home in this one, because a lot of the locations are exactly the same. And Lorule also, it's very similar to Hyrule. So again, if you're familiar with A Link to the Past, you're gonna feel right at home with this game right here. Another new introduction here is the painting mechanic, in which you can stick yourself through walls. You can basically go into walls, and I'm sure you guys have watched many videos, or you guys have played this game already, and you know what I'm talking about. But it's a very interesting feature, and I do have to say that it works remarkably well, both in the dungeons and the dungeons and the overworld, because sometimes once you have that ability to merge into the walls, you're more observant of your environment, and sometimes you see a ledge that you otherwise would have not been able to reach. But by using the merge mechanic, you can go to that particular ledge and find a secret, like a hidden piece of heart or something like that. So once you get that new mechanic engraved into your brain, you can use it to your advantage throughout the game, basically. Now, my main gripes with this game rely on the fact that Nintendo decided to go back to its roots with the series, and you can basically tackle through the dungeons in this game in any order that you want, which a lot of people were happy about that, because the original Zelda for the NES allows you to do that. And I do have to say that I'm not a very big fan of that, for the simple fact that you can tackle through the dungeons in any order, and the game also has a rental system. But the rental system is flawed, in my opinion, because you can rent any item that you want. In fact, you can rent all of the items. And by items, I mean, the typical Zelda items, such as a hook shot, bombs, the bow and arrow, and so forth. Which are items that in previous games you had to earn them at specific dungeons. So the dungeons were based around that item that you got, and the puzzles were based on that item and the items that you got in previous dungeons. And because of the sequential order, I think that the dungeon design in previous games like Ocarina of Time and Twilight Princess were a little bit more solid, because the game already knows what you have in your inventory. Whereas in A Link Between Worlds, the dungeons are very heavily based on around one item, and the item that you need to beat the dungeon is hinted at the beginning of the dungeon or temple that you're visiting. So if you approach a temple, you may see a sign on the outside with the shape of a bomb. So you have to use the bombs in that dungeon. You know that the puzzles are going to be based around that item. So it kind of defeats the purpose, because the game is basically telling you you're going to need this item to beat the dungeon. And it goes back to the old ways of, you get an item, a specific item in that dungeon, except that this time around you have to rent it. I don't know if I'm making any sense, but that kind of irked me a little bit, or not irked me, but it didn't really make sense to me, especially because, well, here's the thing: the game wants to introduce this risk system in which, yeah, you can rent all the items that you want, but if you die, you're going to lose all the items and you have to re-rent them. But there are two things that go against that principle. One of them is that the getting rupees in this game, money, it's extremely easy. So even if you die, it's really easy to, you kill enemies, you cut, trees, or you break pots or whatever. You're gonna get a lot of rupees to rent the items back. So that's one thing. And the second thing is that this game is not very challenging, especially if you're a Link to the Past veteran like myself. I think you're gonna find this game to be somewhat easy, on the easy side. So me personally, I died 3 times in the game, and twice was during the final boss battle. And so basically I only died once during the regular course of the game. And again, I had so much money, I lost all my rented items, but because I had so much money, all I had to do was go back and rent them. So in that sense, a little bit of a flawed system, if you will. And later on in the game, you can purchase the items. So even if you get killed, you get to keep your items. So again, not my favorite approach in terms of progression and in terms of the structure of the game. Personally, I would much rather have the next game to go back to the the Ocarina or A Link to the Past way, where you can you have a sequential order to follow, not one set on stone, because even Ocarina of Time, you were able to sort of pick and choose. For example, after you beat the Forest Temple, I believe you were free to choose whether to go to the Fire Temple or the Water Temple. So it wasn't completely scripted or sequential, if you will. There was a little bit of a freedom, a little bit of freedom. So that's how that's how I like those games, the Zelda games, if you will, to have that a little bit of freedom, but a sequential order at the same time. And I do have to say, going back to the dungeons, the level design is pretty clever. Again, not my favorite because of things that I already mentioned, but nevertheless, the dungeon design is pretty clever, and it's very well suited for a handheld game. You can beat most of the dungeons in one sitting, in 30 minutes. If you know what you're doing, if you're pretty clever at solving the typical Zelda puzzles, if you're pretty good at combat, you can get in and out of a dungeon fairly quickly. And but again, the dungeons, I found them to be pretty easy for the most part, but they're enjoyable, and that's what I'm looking when I'm playing a game. I just want to have fun. I'm not particularly looking for a challenge, or I don't care if the game is too easy. I want to be able to enjoy the game, and this game delivered in that regard. The dungeons are simple, they're short, they're enjoyable, and some of the puzzles are pretty clever. They're not very hard to figure it out. They're pretty straightforward sometimes, but they're pretty clever in how they're presented. And so couple the fact of using certain items with the merging into a painting mechanic makes up for some clever dungeon design. Now the NPC characters in this game, nothing very memorable, to be quite honest. In fact, the sages in this game are pretty forgettable in my opinion. I was not very happy with how they decided to go in that direction. I'm not going to spoil anything, obviously, but like any other Zelda game, not every Zelda game has the sages, but in this game, you get to free them, like in most Zelda games. But I was not a very big fan of them, and the rest of the NPC characters for that matter. The enemies in this game, you're gonna see a lot of familiar faces, if you know what I mean. If you have played A Link to the Past in the past, you're gonna see a lot of familiar enemies, and again, nothing too challenging in the game. As far as completing the game, it took me 21 hours on the dot per my activity log. I did pretty well as far as getting the hard pieces. But here's another thing that perhaps hindered my enjoyment with the game. The fact that you're able to tackle any dungeon in the game really set me off a little bit backwards, because each dungeon has a specific item. For example, you can get an upgraded tunic to get reduced damage from enemies. You can get an upgraded shield, which is a Hylian shield, which allows you to have a better defense. And some of those items are pretty key if you can get them early in the game. And me personally, I think I tackled this game in the most wrong way, because, for example, the Hylian shield, the tunic that I was talking about, I got those items at the very end of the game, and it would have been nice to get them earlier on, just so I didn't have to be way too careful when going through dungeons, because they help you a lot in reducing the damage that you receive from enemies and whatnot. And so if there's any bad order that you can pick to tackle the dungeons, I probably chose that. It was literally the worst order that one could possibly choose. Another thing that affected my enjoyment with this game is there's this, I guess, side quest, if you will, where there's this creature called the Mother Mai, in which if you rescue her, she has 100 babies scattered throughout both Hyrule and Lorule. And if you rescue all of her children or babies, for every 10 of them, you get an upgrade. So you get an upgrade on purchased items that you have. Not rental items, but purchased items. And it wasn't until I think I had 2 dungeons left in the game that I unlocked this side quest that you can unlock literally when the game starts, I believe. I'm not sure, because I talked to this creature right at the end of the game, and it would have been nice for me to get to know this Mother Mai from the get-go. That way I could look for her babies while I go from dungeon to dungeon and so forth. So I think that affected my enjoyment a little bit, in the sense that I found her at the very end of the game, and I didn't really bother. I didn't really want to bother catching all 100 babies, because I was basically at the end of the game. I just wanted to see the ending and how the story ended. I did end up getting 30 out of 100 Mai, so I was able to upgrade 3 items in the game. But again, it would have been nice for me to unlock this side quest at the beginning of the game. That way I was able I would have enjoyed it a little bit more, in my opinion. So a couple factors that really hinder my enjoyment, and it's not the game's fault. It's really, it was up to me to choose the order of dungeons, and for some reason I chose a very wrong order, if you will. And I guess I wasn't careful enough to unlock the Mai side quests and whatnot. But again, that's not the game's fault. Partially, but it's almost kind of like my fault for not being more observant, if you will. But nevertheless, this is a very good game, a must-have for any 3DS owner. And if you're a newcomer to the Zelda series, this is a perfect place to start, because in my opinion the game is not very challenging. There is a hero mode that you unlocked at the end of the game when you beat the game, and supposedly it's a much more challenging. So there's a added replay value because of the hero mode, and again, I highly recommend this game. It's a very good game. It's just failed to meet my overly high expectations, because after all, this is a sequel to one of my all-time favorite games, A Link to the Past, and the game delivered, but not quite on the level that I was hoping or expecting. Nevertheless, very good game and a must-have for any 3DS owner. So thank you guys for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you all later.